History remembers King Leopold II as a builder king, but behind the majestic architecture of Brussels lies a foundation of bones. Under the guise of a humanitarian mission to civilize the Congo, Leopold orchestrated a genocide that claimed an estimated 10 million lives. This wasn't a war, it was a corporate slaughterhouse. Villages burned, families were severed, and hands were harvested as currency for rubber. It is the story of how one man turned an entire heart of Africa into a private, blood-soaked colony. Discover the forgotten Holocaust of the Butcher of Congo. The ambition of a minor king. Leopold II ascended the Belgian throne in 1865 with a chip on his shoulder. Belgium was a small, neutral nation, often overlooked by the great powers of Europe. To Leopold, a king without a colony was a king without true power. He looked at the vast empires of Britain and France with intense envy. However, the Belgian government and its people were largely disinterested in the costly, risky business of overseas expansion. Leopold was undeterred. If the state would not give him a colony, he would acquire one himself as a private citizen. He spent years scouting the globe, looking at the Philippines and parts of South America before his eyes settled on the great blank space of Central Africa, the Congo Basin. The humanitarian mask. Leopold knew that in the late 19th century, a naked land grab would be condemned by other European powers. To get what he wanted, he needed a masterstroke of public relations. In 1876, he organized the International African Association, Association Internationale Africaine. He spoke with tears in his eyes about the horrors of the Arab slave trade and the need to bring Christianity, civilization, and commerce to the dark interior of Africa. He promised to build roads, hospitals, and schools. He claimed he wanted no profit for himself, only the moral satisfaction of uplifting the primitive Congolese. The world was fooled. The association was seen as a noble, charitable venture, with Leopold as its selfless chairman. The man on the ground, Henry Morton Stanley. To turn his map dreams into reality, Leopold hired the famous Welsh-American explorer Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley had recently gained worldwide fame for finding David Livingstone. Stanley was a man of immense grit, but brutal methods. Between 1879 and 1884, Stanley trekked through the dense Congo rainforests, navigating the treacherous Congo River. His mission was simple: sign treaties with local chiefs. These chiefs, who spoke no European languages and had no concept of private land ownership as understood in Europe, were given trinkets, cloth, and gin. In exchange, they signed documents, often marked with an X, that ceded their land and their people's labor to Leopold's association in perpetuity. Stanley's methods were often violent. Villages that refused to cooperate were razed. By the time he was done, Leopold had legal claim to a territory 76 times the size of Belgium. The Berlin Conference, legalizing the theft. The final piece of Leopold's puzzle was international recognition. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, the great powers of Europe met to carve up Africa without a single African present. Leopold played the powers against each other. He convinced France that he would act as a buffer against Britain, and convinced Britain that he would keep the Congo as a free trade zone. The result was the creation of the Congo Free State, État indépendant du Congo. Crucially, it was not a Belgian colony. It was the personal property of Leopold II. He was the sole owner, the sole legislator, and the sole judge. He had achieved what no other individual in history had ever done. He owned a country of 900,000 square miles as a private business. The financial desperation. Owning a colony of that size was expensive. In the early years, Leopold nearly went bankrupt. He poured his personal fortune into building a railway from the coast to Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, to bypass the cataracts of the lower Congo River. The world watched, expecting his grand humanitarian experiment to fail. But then, the world changed. The invention of the inflatable bicycle tire by John Boyd Dunlop and the rise of the automobile industry created a sudden, insatiable global demand for rubber. The Congo was home to the world's largest supply of wild rubber vines, Landolphia owari. Leopold's bankrupt project was sitting on a mountain of red gold. The birth of the Force Publique. To extract this rubber, Leopold needed an army. He created the Force Publique, a mercenary force composed of African soldiers, often child soldiers or captives, led by white European officers. These men were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were debt collectors and slave drivers. The stage was set, the treaties were signed, the international community was silent, and the demand for rubber was peaking. Leopold's civilizing mission was about to transform into the most efficient, brutal extraction machine the world had ever seen. The heart of darkness was not the Congo itself, but the greed of the man in Brussels who had never set foot in Africa. By the early 1990s, the Congo Free State had shifted from an expensive territorial project into a high-speed extraction engine. Leopold II realized that ivory was profitable, but wild rubber was a gold mine. However, wild rubber in the Congo was not grown on neat plantations like the later British projects in Southeast Asia. It grew as thick, tangled vines, Landolphia, that wrapped themselves around giant trees deep in the jungle. Collecting it was grueling, dangerous, and time-consuming. To maximize profit, Leopold eliminated the free trade he had promised at the Berlin Conference. He declared all vacant land, which was essentially all land not under a village's immediate hut, as the property of the state. This meant the Congolese were now squatters on their own ancestral lands, and the rubber vines they harvested belonged to the king. The quota system, slavery by another name. Leopold's administration divided the Congo into several zones. Some were managed directly by the state, while others were leased to concession companies like the ABIR, Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company. Leopold held massive shares in these companies, ensuring a double stream of income. The system was simple. Every village was given a rubber quota. Every man was required to deliver a certain amount of high-quality rubber every 2 weeks. To collect this rubber, men had to trek days into the deep forest, climb trees as high as 100 feet, tap the vines, and smear the sap on their bodies to let it dry before peeling it off, a process that often ripped off their hair and skin. Because this labor was unpaid and took men away from hunting and farming, no one wanted to do it. Leopold's solution was the hostage system. The hostage houses. The Force Publique would march into a village and seize the women, children, and elders. These hostages were thrown into filthy stockades. The village chief was then told, "If you want your wives and children back, bring us the rubber." While the men were away in the forest, the hostages often starved or died of disease. In many cases, the women were systematically raped by the Force Publique soldiers or their officers. If a village failed its quota, the hostages were often murdered, or the village was burned to the ground. This wasn't trade, it was a hostage-based economy where the currency was human life. The harvest of hands. One of the most gruesome aspects of Leopold's reign was the basket of hands. The Force Publique officers were worried that their African soldiers would waste expensive European imported ammunition for hunting animals for food, or worse, use the bullets to start a mutiny.
To prevent this, the officers required a human return for every bullet fired. For every cartridge used, the soldier had to bring back the severed right hand of a dead victim to prove that the bullet had not been wasted. This led to a macabre market in hands. If a soldier missed his target or used a bullet on a bird, he would go to a nearby village and cut the hand off a living person, often a child, to account for the spent casing. Baskets of smoked hands were presented to European district commissioners as if they were tally sheets. There are surviving photographs from this era that haunt the collective memory of the world. Fathers staring at the severed hand and foot of their 5-year-old daughter, a punishment for the village's low rubber production. The destruction of the social fabric. The rubber regime destroyed the Congolese society from the inside out. With the men forced into the forest and the women held hostage, no one was planting crops. Famine swept through the Congo basin. Weakened by hunger, the population became easy prey for diseases. Smallpox, sleeping sickness, and respiratory infections decimated entire regions. In some areas, the population dropped by 50% or more. The Butcher of Congo was not just killing people with bullets and machetes, he was killing them by destroying their ability to survive. The white officers, a culture of sadism. The European officers in the Congo were often men who could not find work in their own countries or were looking for a place where they could exercise absolute power without consequence. In the humid heat of the jungle, thousands of miles from the civilized eyes of Brussels, many descended into a terrifying brand of madness and sadism. Accounts from the time describe officers who kept severed heads as garden ornaments, or who forced men to work until they dropped dead from exhaustion, only to be replaced by the next laborer. The chicote, a whip made of sun-dried hippopotamus hide with razor-sharp edges, became the symbol of Belgian authority. 20 strokes could leave a man unconscious. 100 strokes were a death sentence. The financial windfall. While the Congo bled, Brussels flourished. Leopold II used the red rubber money to fund massive public works in Belgium. He built the Cinquantenaire Arch, the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, and his magnificent palace at Laeken. He was celebrated as a visionary. The Belgian public, largely ignorant of the horrors in the jungle, cheered their builder king. Leopold was careful to keep the accounts of the Congo Free State separate from the Belgian state, and he guarded the secrets of his private colony with a fanatical intensity. He knew that if the truth ever reached the halls of London or Washington, his private empire would crumble. The cracks began to show. Leopold had built his empire on the foundation of lies and silence. But in the late 1990s, the silence began to break. A few brave missionaries, both Swedish and American, began to write letters home about the unbelievable atrocities they were witnessing. They spoke of scorched earth, of piles of hands, and of a population that lived in a state of permanent terror. But Leopold's PR machine was powerful. He dismissed these reports as Protestant lies designed to smear a Catholic monarch. But Leopold's luck was about to run out, thanks to an observant shipping clerk in the port of Antwerp named E.D. Morel.
The shipping clerk who saw too much. In the late 1890s, the port of Antwerp was one of the busiest in the world, serving as the primary gateway for the riches flowing out of the Congo. Among the many employees working for the Elder Dempster shipping line was a young, observant Anglo-French clerk named Edmond Dean Morel. Morel's job was to monitor the manifests of the ships traveling between Belgium and Leopoldville. As he looked at the ledgers, he noticed a mathematical anomaly that would change the course of history. He saw ship after ship arriving from the Congo, laden to the brim with high-value rubber and ivory. However, When he looked at the return manifests, the goods being sent back to the Congo, he saw no commercial trade. There were no textiles, no tools, no machinery, and no food being sent to pay for the rubber. Instead, the ships heading to Africa were filled with only three things: soldiers, modern rifles, and massive amounts of ammunition. Morel reached a chilling conclusion. Since the Congolese were receiving nothing in exchange for their labor and resources, they were not trading. They were being systematically enslaved at gunpoint. Realizing he was a witness to a silent Holocaust, Morel resigned from his job and dedicated his life to exposing the king of the Belgians. The birth of the Congo Reform Association. E.D. Morel was a master of media and investigative journalism. He launched the West African Mail and began publishing harrowing accounts from the interior of the Congo. He understood that in a world without the internet, visual evidence was the only thing that would pierce the public's indifference. He teamed up with missionaries like Alice Seeley Harris, who had taken some of the first Kodak photographs of the atrocities. These images, showing children with severed limbs and mourning fathers, became the first viral images of human rights abuses in history. In 1904, Morel founded the Congo Reform Association. It was the first mass movement human rights organization of the 20th century. He didn't just target the working class, he recruited the cultural elite. Mark Twain, Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and Booker T. Washington all joined the cause. Mark Twain famously wrote King Leopold's Soliloquy, a biting satire where Leopold complains that his humanitarian mask is slipping because of the meddling of incorruptible photographers. The Casement Report, official confirmation. Under immense pressure from the CRA and the British public, the British government, which had been a signatory to the Berlin Act, felt forced to act. They sent their consul in the region, an Irishman named Roger Casement, to conduct an official investigation. Casement spent weeks traveling through the Upper Congo, moving away from the model villages shown to tourists and deep into the rubber-producing regions. What he found was worse than the rumors. He spoke to survivors whose families had been wiped out, documented the hostage houses, and confirmed the systematic mutilation of workers. His 1904 report, the Casement Report, was a diplomatic bombshell. It provided official, undeniable government proof that Leopold's Free State was a slave labor camp of continental proportions. For the first time, Leopold's civilizing mission was legally branded as a regime of terror. Leopold's counterattack and the Commission of Inquiry. Leopold II was not a man to surrender easily. He possessed a fortune of millions and used it to launch a massive international lobbying campaign. He bribed journalists, funded pro-Leopold pamphlets, and even attempted to buy the silence of American politicians. To silence the British, he audaciously appointed his own Commission of Inquiry. He expected the hand-picked judges to clear his name. However, Leopold made a fatal mistake. The judges were honest men. When they traveled to the Congo and heard the heartbreaking testimony of the Congolese people, they were moved to tears. The Commission's final report, published in 1905, did not clear the king. While it used softer language than Casement, it confirmed the primary horrors: the forced labor, the hostage-taking, and the violent coercion. The mask was gone. Leopold II, once the philanthropist king, was now the Butcher of Congo in the eyes of the global public. The strategic burn, destroying the evidence. As the international pressure became a roar, even the Belgian government, which had long ignored the Congo, felt the monarchy was threatening the stability of the nation. They began negotiations to take the Congo away from Leopold and turn it into a regular Belgian colony.
Leopold was furious. He treated the Congo as his private business and felt he was being robbed. Before he handed over the keys in 1908, he committed one final act of calculated malice. For 8 straight days in August 1908, the furnaces of his palace in Brussels and his offices in the Congo ran at full heat. He burned the archives of the Congo Free State. Millions of pages of records, orders, and reports went up in smoke. He told an aide, "I will give them my Congo, but they have no right to know what I did there." He successfully erased the names of the victims, the specific orders for the massacres, and the paper trail of his personal profit. To this day, historians struggle to find the exact number of the dead because the butcher made sure the evidence was reduced to ash. The transfer of power. In 1908, the Congo Free State officially became the Belgian Congo. Leopold II died a year later, in 1909. At his funeral, the Belgian public, once his greatest admirers, booed his coffin as it passed through the streets of Brussels. However, the change in management did not mean an immediate end to the suffering. The Belgian government inherited a system based on extraction and racial hierarchy. While the severed hands mostly stopped, the forced labor for copper and gold mines continued for decades. The forgotten genocide had ended its most violent phase, but the scars on the land and the people were deep, permanent, and would shape the tragic history of the Congo for the next century.
The final days of a private empire. By 1908, the international outcry had reached a fever pitch. Leopold II, once the master of grand deceptions, found himself cornered. The Belgian government, fearing that the monarchy itself might collapse under the weight of the king's atrocities, moved to annex the Congo Free State. Leopold did not surrender easily. He demanded a massive financial payout from the Belgian state, essentially forcing the people he had already robbed to pay for his retirement. Shortly before his death in 1909, Leopold took a final, spiteful action against history. He ordered the incineration of all administrative records of the Congo Free State. For days, the chimneys of his palace belched black smoke as millions of documents, proof of quotas, massacres, and personal profit, turned to ash. He famously said, "I will give them my Congo, but they have no right to know what I did there." This act of historical arson is why we may never know the exact names of the millions who perished. The human cost. A generation erased. The statistical toll of Leopold's reign is staggering, yet statistics often fail to capture the visceral horror. Estimates suggest that between 10 million people died during the rubber regime, roughly half of the Congo's population at the time. This was not always the result of direct execution. The genocide was a combination of mass murder, systematic famine, and the introduction of European diseases to a population weakened by overwork and terror. The social fabric of the Congo Basin was decimated. With men forced into the forest and women held in hostage camps, the traditional agricultural cycles were broken. Villages were abandoned. Children grew up in a world where the primary interaction with civilization was the whip and the machete. The basket of hands left thousands of survivors disabled, creating a society of trauma that would be passed down through DNA and oral history for generations. The Belgian Congo: transition or transformation? When the Belgian state took over in 1908, the most extreme atrocities, like the severing of hands, gradually subsided. However, the underlying structure of the colony remained one of extractive exploitation. The Belgian government inherited a machine built for profit, not for people.
The forced labor system merely shifted its focus. As the demand for rubber stabilized, the focus turned to copper, diamonds, and gold. The Congolese people remained second-class citizens in their own land, denied education beyond the elementary level, and barred from any meaningful political participation until the very end of colonial rule in 1960. The civilizing mission Leopold promised was never realized. Instead, the Congo became a vast warehouse of resources for the Western world. The Cold War and the ghost of Leopold. The legacy of the Butcher did not end with Belgian withdrawal. When the Congo finally gained independence in 1960, it was a nation with fewer than 30 university graduates. This vacuum of leadership and the deep-seated trauma of colonial violence made the country a playground for Cold War tensions. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the rise of the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko can be seen as the second act of Leopold's tragedy. Mobutu, in many ways, modeled his rule after Leopold, treating the nation's wealth as a personal bank account while the infrastructure crumbled. The cycle of resource-driven conflict that continues in the eastern Congo today over minerals like coltan is a direct descendant of the red rubber system. The world still demands the Congo's resources, and the Congo still pays in blood. History's judgment and the struggle for memory. For decades, Belgium practiced a form of collective amnesia. In the Royal Museum for Central Africa, Leopold was portrayed as a noble explorer. Statues of him stood tall in Brussels and Ostend, and schoolbooks ignored the genocide. It was only in recent years, sparked by historians like Adam Hochschild and the global Black Lives Matter movement, that Belgium began to confront its past. In 2020, King Philip of Belgium expressed his deepest regrets for the wounds of the past, the first time a Belgian monarch had officially acknowledged the suffering. Statues of Leopold were defaced and removed, and the narrative finally began to shift from the Builder King to the Butcher of Congo. Conclusion: a lesson for humanity. The story of King Leopold II is a terrifying reminder of what happens when absolute power meets unchecked greed. It is a cautionary tale of how humanitarian rhetoric can be used to mask the most heinous crimes against humanity. Leopold never set foot in the Congo. He orchestrated a Holocaust from the comfort of a palace, viewing millions of lives as mere entries in a ledger. The forgotten genocide is no longer forgotten. By remembering the victims, the fathers who lost their daughters, the workers who lost their hands, and the civilization that lost its future, we ensure that the Butcher's final act of burning the archives did not succeed. The truth has survived the fire. The Congo's heart still beats, scarred but resilient, demanding a future that is finally its own.